A lone farmer in the Old West thought he'd lost everything to flames 7 years ago. But when two mysterious orphans appeared at his door asking about the woman in his old painting, his deceased wife, everything changed. This is the incredible true story of how love transcends death and creates family in the most unexpected ways. If this story touches your heart, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss these amazing tales of human resilience. Trust me, you won't believe how this unfolds. The Wyoming wind carried the scent of sagebrush and distant rain across the vast plains, but Thomas McKinley barely noticed as he worked the dry soil with his worn hands. The sun hung low in the October sky, casting long shadows across his modest farm that stretched toward the horizon like fingers reaching for something long lost. His weathered face, marked by years of harsh sun and harder grief, remained focused on the task at hand, fixing the fence that separated his property from the endless wilderness beyond. It had been 7 years since the fire, 7 years since the night that changed everything. When he returned from town to find his small farmhouse engulfed in flames, his wife Sarah and their 6-year-old daughter Emma trapped inside. The volunteer fire brigade had done their best, but in those days, help was scarce and water even scarcer. By the time the flames were extinguished, Thomas had lost everything that mattered. He'd rebuilt the house, of course. A man needed shelter, and the land was still good despite his broken heart. But the new structure lacked the warmth of the original home Sarah had filled with her laughter and Emma's playful shouts. Now it stood as functional as a barn, serving its purpose but holding no joy. The only remnant of his former life was the oil painting that hung above the fireplace, a portrait of Sarah that a traveling artist had painted for their 5th wedding anniversary. Her gentle eyes seemed to follow him wherever he went in the house, a constant reminder of love and loss intertwined. Thomas straightened his back, feeling the familiar ache that came with 53 years of hard living. His neighbor, Jacob Morrison, had stopped by that morning with news from town. 2 children, orphaned when their parents died of fever, had been staying at the church for weeks. The Reverend was looking for someone to take them in, as the church's resources were stretched thin with winter approaching. "Thought you might consider it, Tom," Jacob had said, his voice gentle but hopeful. "House gets mighty quiet with just one person rattling around in it." Thomas had dismissed the suggestion without much thought. What did he know about raising children anymore? The memory of Emma's last bedtime story, the way she curled up against his chest while he read from her favorite book about far-off lands and brave adventures, felt both precious and painful. He'd failed to protect his own child. How could he be trusted with someone else's? The approaching thunder rumbled across the plains, and Thomas gathered his tools, knowing the storm would hit before nightfall. As he walked toward the house, his eyes caught sight of 2 small figures in the distance, moving slowly along the dirt road that led to his property. Travelers were rare in these parts, especially on foot, and especially children. As they drew closer, Thomas could make out their details more clearly. A boy who looked to be about 10 years old, tall for his age but thin, walked beside a girl who couldn't have been more than 7. Their clothes were clean but worn, the kind distributed by church charity, and they each carried a small bundle of belongings. The boy held the girl's hand protectively, scanning the horizon with eyes too old for his young face. Thomas set down his tools on the porch and waited. Something about their purposeful stride suggested they weren't lost or merely seeking shelter from the approaching storm. They were coming to his farm specifically, though he couldn't imagine why. When they reached the fence line, the boy called out, his voice carrying clearly across the yard despite the wind. "Excuse me, sir. Are you Thomas McKinley?" The question surprised him. Few people sought him out by name anymore. "I am," he replied, studying their faces. "What can I do for you?" The children exchanged a meaningful glance before the boy spoke again. "My name is Samuel, and this is my sister Ruth. We've come from the church in town. Reverend Williams told us about you, but that's not why we're here." He paused, seeming to gather courage. "We're here because of her." Her. Thomas felt a strange chill that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. Ruth stepped forward, her small voice barely audible above the wind. "The lady in the painting. The one with the kind eyes and the blue dress. We know her." Thomas felt the world shift slightly beneath his feet. Sarah's portrait was visible through the front window, but from this distance, these children couldn't possibly make out such details. Yet Ruth had described it perfectly. The blue dress Sarah had worn for the sitting, the gentle expression the artist had captured so perfectly. "You couldn't know her," Thomas said, his voice hoarse. "She's been gone for 7 years." Samuel nodded solemnly. "We know, sir. That's exactly why we're here." The first fat raindrops began to fall as Thomas led the children into a house, their small boots echoing on the wooden floors that had known only his solitary footsteps for so long. Ruth immediately gravitated toward the fireplace, her eyes fixed on Sarah's portrait with an intensity that made Thomas's chest tighten. Samuel remained close to his sister, his protective stance never wavering. But his gaze also found the painting. "She was beautiful," Ruth whispered, her small hand reaching toward the mantelpiece before stopping short, as if afraid to touch something sacred. Thomas busied himself lighting the oil lamps as darkness gathered outside, the storm now fully upon them. The familiar ritual gave him time to process what was happening. Children in his house again, voices other than his own filling the space. It felt like walking through a dream of his former life. "You said you know her," Thomas said finally, settling into his worn armchair while the children remained standing uncertainly near the fireplace. "But that's impossible. Sarah, my wife, she died in the fire that took this house 7 years ago." Samuel reached into his bundle and withdrew a small, leather-bound book. The cover was worn smooth from handling, and several loose pages threatened to escape from between the covers. "Our mother kept a journal," he said, offering it to Thomas with reverent care. "She wrote about everyone who helped us when we were little, before she and Pa got the fever." Thomas accepted the journal with hesitant hands. The leather was soft with age, and when he opened it, he immediately recognized the careful script of an educated woman. The entries were dated, beginning 8 years earlier, when Samuel would have been barely 2 and Ruth just born. "May 15th, 1868, Thomas read aloud. "A kind woman came to our camp today with food and blankets. The children were hungry, and James was too proud to accept charity, but she wouldn't take no for an answer. She said her name was Sarah McKinley, and she had a little girl of her own. She understood what it meant to worry about keeping children fed and safe." Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he turned the page. More entries followed, documenting multiple encounters with Sarah over the course of several months. Apparently, the children's family had been part of a wagon train that had been forced to winter near the territorial border when Ruth became ill with pneumonia. "Look at this one," Samuel said, leaning closer and pointing to an entry dated December 1868. "Ma wrote about how Mrs. McKinley brought medicine and sat up all night, helping her tend to Ruth when the fever was highest." Thomas read silently, his vision blurring as he absorbed his wife's kindness toward strangers. Sarah had never mentioned helping a family in distress, but that was typical of her nature. She'd always said that kindness given quietly was kindness that mattered most. Ruth had found a chair to drag closer to Thomas, climbing up so she could see the journal pages. "Ma used to read us these stories when we were little," she said. "She told us about the angel lady who saved my life, and how someday we might be able to thank her properly. But your mother never found Sarah again?" Thomas asked, though he knew the answer. If they had met again, surely Sarah would have told him about it. "Our pa got work at a ranch down in Colorado," Samuel explained. "We moved south before spring, and Ma always regretted not saying goodbye proper-like. She kept saying she'd write a letter someday, but then life got busy, and then—" His voice trailed off. "Then they both got the fever last spring." Ruth finished quietly. "Ma made me promise to keep the journal safe. She said maybe someday we'd find Mrs. McKinley and tell her how much her kindness meant." Thomas closed the journal carefully, his throat tight with emotion. Outside, the storm raged with increasing intensity, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling around the eaves. The sound reminded him too vividly of that terrible night 7 years ago, when he'd stood helpless watching flames consume his world. "The Reverend in town told us about the fire," Samuel said gently, as if reading Thomas's thoughts. "He said you lost your wife and daughter. We're real sorry about that, Mr. McKinley. We didn't come to make you sad," Ruth added quickly, her young face earnest with concern. "We just wanted you to know that she was special to us too, that she mattered." Thomas looked up at Sarah's portrait, seeing it now through different eyes. For 7 years, he'd viewed it as a memorial to his loss, a beautiful reminder of everything taken from him. But these children saw something else, evidence of love shared, kindness given freely, lives touched and saved. "She would have liked knowing you came," Thomas said finally. Sarah always said that love multiplied when it was shared, never divided. He paused, studying their young faces in the lamplight. "But you didn't walk all this way in a storm just to tell me about some journal entries from 8 years ago." Samuel and Ruth exchanged another one of their meaningful looks, and Thomas was beginning to recognize it as their way of communicating without words, the kind of understanding that developed between siblings who'd learned to depend only on each other. "Reverend Williams said you might have work." Samuel said carefully, "We don't want charity, Mr. McKinley. We're willing to earn our keep. I'm strong for my age, and Ruth's good with chickens and gardening. We just need somewhere to stay until we're old enough to make our own way." The honesty in the boy's voice struck Thomas deeply. Here was a child who'd already learned that the world could be harsh and uncertain, but who faced it with dignity intact. Thomas saw something of himself in that stubborn pride, but also something of Sarah in the way Ruth unconsciously leaned against her brother for comfort. "Winter's coming on hard," Thomas said slowly. "This isn't an easy place for children." "We're not afraid of work," Ruth said firmly, her chin lifting in a gesture that reminded Thomas so strongly of Emma that his breath caught. "And we're not afraid of being alone out here. We've been alone lots of places." "That's different from being isolated," Thomas replied. "The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away. Town is a full day's ride. If something happened—" "Things happen everywhere," Samuel interrupted, his voice matter of fact. "At least here, we'd be somewhere that mattered to Ma. Somewhere Mrs. McKinley's spirit might still be watching over folks." Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, like ice beginning to crack after a long, hard winter. These children had sought him out not just for shelter, but because they felt a connection to Sarah that transcended death. They brought him a gift he hadn't known he needed, proof that his wife's kindness had created ripples that continued long after she was gone. The storm passed during the night, leaving the morning air crisp and clear. Thomas woke to unfamiliar sounds, quiet whispers and the soft padding of small feet on wooden floors. For a moment, he lay still in his bed, disoriented by the presence of other people in his house. The children had slept in the main room, Ruth on the sofa and Samuel on a makeshift bed of blankets near the fireplace. When Thomas emerged from his bedroom, he found them already awake and attempting to make breakfast with the limited supplies they could reach. Ruth stood on a chair trying to work the coffee pot, while Samuel struggled with the cast-iron skillet that was nearly as big as his torso. "Here now," Thomas said, moving to take over the cooking. "You'll burn the place down if you're not careful." "We didn't want to wake you," Samuel said, stepping back, but staying close enough to help. "Ma always said guests should earn their keep on the first day." "You're not guests," Thomas replied, then paused, surprised by his own words. He hadn't meant to imply they were staying permanently, but something about the morning light streaming through windows that had seemed so empty yesterday made the house feel different, more alive, as they ate breakfast together. Thomas found himself studying the children more carefully. Ruth had their mother's delicate features, but Samuel bore the sturdy build of a boy destined to become a strong man. Both had intelligent eyes and careful manners that spoke of good upbringing despite their recent hardships. "Tell me about your parents," Thomas said. "What kind of people were they?" Samuel's face lit up. "Pa was a carpenter back in Missouri before we came west. He could build anything, houses, furniture, even toys. He made Ruth a dollhouse one Christmas that was so fine other folks wanted to buy it. And Ma was a teacher before she married Pa," Ruth added. "She taught us to read and write and do sums. She said education was the one thing nobody could ever take away from you." Thomas nodded approvingly. "Your mother was right about that. Sarah felt the same way. She taught our Emma to read before she was even 4 years old." The mention of Emma brought a moment of silence, but it wasn't the painful kind Thomas usually experienced when thinking of his daughter. Instead, It felt natural to speak of her in the presence of these children who'd never known her, but somehow carried forward the legacy of kindness her mother had begun. After breakfast, Thomas showed them around the property. The farm was modest, but well-maintained: a vegetable garden, a chicken coop, a small barn with 2 horses, and a milk cow. Samuel asked thoughtful questions about the crops and livestock, while Ruth immediately gravitated toward the chickens, laughing when the boldest hen pecked at her shoelaces. "We could expand the garden come spring," Samuel suggested, studying the layout with a practical eye. "Ma taught us about crop rotation and soil preparation. We helped her grow enough vegetables to feed 6 families back in Colorado. And I know about preserving food for winter," Ruth added. "Ma said it was important to be ready for lean times." Thomas found their enthusiasm infectious. For years, he'd worked the farm with grim determination, going through the motions of survival without joy or hope for future. These children spoke of spring plans and long-term improvements as if they belonged here, as if this place could be home. As the day progressed, Thomas watched them settle into routines of farm life with surprising ease. Samuel proved capable beyond his years, helping repair a section of fence with steady hands and careful attention to detail. Ruth appointed herself caretaker of the chickens, talking to them in a gentle voice that reminded Thomas achingly of Emma's chatter during her evening animal rounds. That evening, as they sat around the fireplace after supper, Ruth asked if she could look at Sarah's portrait more closely. Thomas lifted her up so she could study the painting at eye level. "She has happy eyes," Ruth observed. "Even though she looks serious, you can tell she was thinking about something that made her smile. The artist painted that just after we learned Emma was growing inside her." Thomas said quietly, "Sarah was excited about becoming a mother." "She was lucky to have you and Emma," Samuel said. "Even if it wasn't for very long, she got to have a real family." The simple observation hit Thomas with unexpected force. He'd spent 7 years focusing on what had been taken from him, but these children saw what had been given. Sarah had experienced love, marriage, motherhood. She'd made a difference in the world, touching lives beyond her own family's small circle. "You know," Thomas said slowly, "Sarah always wanted more children. She used to say our house was too quiet with just Emma running around." Ruth turned to look at him from her perch near the painting. "Do you think she would have liked us?" Thomas studied her earnest face, then looked at Samuel, who was watching the conversation with the careful attention of a boy who'd learned to read adult moods for survival. "I think she would have loved you both," he said honestly. "Sarah had a gift for seeing the best in people. She would have seen your courage, Samuel, and your kind heart, Ruth. Then maybe," Ruth said carefully, "maybe we could stay and be the children she wanted. Not to replace Emma," she added quickly, "but to keep the family feeling alive in this house." Thomas felt tears threaten for the first time in years. Not the bitter tears of grief he'd grown accustomed to, but the sweet ache of unexpected hope. These children needed him, but perhaps he needed them just as much. They'd lost their parents, and he'd lost his family. Together, they might create something new while honoring what they'd lost. "We'd have to talk about rules," Thomas said, his voice gruff with emotion. "School during winter months. I can teach you reading and arithmetic, but you need proper education come spring. Chores every day, no exceptions. And church on Sundays when weather permits." Samuel sat up straighter. "Yes, sir. We understand." And Thomas continued, looking directly at Ruth, "If you're going to live here, you need to understand this is dangerous country. No wandering off alone. No taking chances. I won't lose anyone else to carelessness or bad luck." Ruth nodded solemnly. "We promise, Mr. McKinley. We'll be careful." "If we're going to be a family," Thomas said, the word feeling foreign but right on his tongue, "you should probably call me something other than Mr. McKinley." The children looked at each other uncertainly. "What would you like us to call you?" Samuel asked. Thomas considered. He wasn't their father, and he wouldn't pretend to replace the man they'd loved and lost. But he could be something else: a guardian, a protector, a bridge between their past and future. "Uncle Thomas," he said finally, "if that suits you." Ruth's face broke into the first truly joyful smile he'd seen from her. "Uncle Thomas," she repeated, testing the words. "I like that." Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a renewed sense of purpose that transformed the McKinley farm. Samuel had proven himself invaluable through the harsh winter months, learning to care for the livestock and maintain equipment with an aptitude that impressed Thomas daily. Ruth had appointed herself keeper of the household, organizing their small living space with the efficiency of someone twice her age while continuing to provide endless entertainment with her observations about farm life. The children had thrived under Thomas's patient instruction. Evenings were spent around the kitchen table with books and slates, Samuel working through advanced arithmetic, while Ruth practiced her letters. Both children showed the intellectual curiosity their mother had fostered, asking questions that challenged Thomas to explain everything from weather patterns to the territorial government. As the snow melted and the first green shoots appeared in the garden, Thomas found himself making plans that extended far beyond mere survival. He'd ordered fruit trees from the territorial capital, planning an orchard that would take years to mature. Samuel had convinced him to expand the chicken coop, arguing persuasively that they could sell eggs in town for extra income. Ruth had requested space for a flower garden, like Ma used to have, and Thomas had agreed without hesitation. The transformation wasn't limited to the farm. Thomas discovered that grief, while never fully absent, had evolved into something more manageable when balanced against the daily joys of family life. Ruth's laughter echoing through the house, Samuel's eager questions about farming techniques, the simple pleasure of sharing meals and evening conversations. These experiences didn't erase his memories of Sarah and Emma, but they provided new reasons to look forward rather than back. One morning in late April, as Thomas worked alongside Samuel to plant the expanded vegetable garden, a rider approached from the direction of town. Thomas recognized the horse before he could make out the rider. It was Jacob Morrison, his closest neighbor, coming at a pace that suggested important news. "Tom," Jacob called as he dismounted near the garden. "Got word from town you need to hear." Thomas straightened, wiping soil from his hands. "What kind of word?" "Territorial inspectors coming through next month. Routine visit mostly, but he's specifically asking about children being placed with families. Apparently, there have been some problems down south, with kids being taken in for the wrong reasons." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He'd been so focused on the daily reality of caring for Samuel and Ruth that he'd almost forgotten their legal situation remained unofficial. The church had been grateful to have him placed, but no formal adoption had been arranged. "What kind of problems?" Samuel asked, appearing at Thomas's elbow with a protective alertness that still surfaced whenever adult conversations turned serious. Jacob glanced at the boy with sympathy. "Nothing for you to worry about, son. Just bureaucrats wanting to make sure all the paperwork's in order." He turned back to Thomas. "Point is, if you're planning to keep them permanent, you'll need to make it legal. Reverend William said he'd help with the process, but it has to be done proper." That evening, Thomas called the children together for what he privately thought of as the most important conversation of their new life together. Ruth curled up in her favorite spot on the sofa, while Samuel sat attentively in the chair they designated as is for evening study sessions. "We need to talk about making things official," Thomas began. "There's going to be a territorial inspector coming to check on how you're doing here. If we want to stay together as a family, we'll need to go through proper legal channels." Ruth looked puzzled. "What does that mean?" "It means Uncle Thomas would have to officially adopt us," Samuel explained, his voice carefully neutral. "Make us legally his children." Thomas studied their faces, tried to read their reactions. "The question is whether that's what you want. Adoption is permanent. It would make this your home forever, and me your legal guardian. You'd take the McKinley name, and you'd be my heirs when I'm gone. But what about our real parents?" Ruth asked, her voice small. "Would we have to forget about Ma and Pa?" "Never," Thomas said firmly. "Your parents will always be your parents. Nothing can change that, and nothing should. Adoption would mean you'd have two sets of parents. The ones who gave you life and raised you with love, and the ones who choose to continue that love going forward." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his mature mind clearly working through the implications. "Would you want to adopt us?" he asked finally. "Really want to, not just because it's the right thing to do?" Thomas reached for Sarah's journal, which had become a permanent fixture on the side table next to his chair. "This book brought you to me," he said, opening it to a page he'd marked weeks earlier. But what made me want you to stay wasn't obligation to your mother's memory or even to Sarah's kindness. It was watching Ruth teach the chickens to eat from her hand. It was listening to you ask questions about why certain crops grow better in different soil. It was coming home to voices in this house again, to laughter and arguments and all the beautiful noise that makes a place a home instead of just a building. Ruth slipped down from the sofa and came to stand beside his chair. "We want to stay forever," she said simply. "This feels like home now." Samuel nodded agreement. "Our parents would want us to be safe and loved. They'd understand." 3 weeks later, on a clear May morning, Thomas drove the wagon into town with both children dressed in their best clothes. Reverend Williams had arranged for the territorial inspector to meet them at the church, where the formal adoption proceedings would take place. The inspector turned out to be a kind man named Frederick Hayes, who spent considerable time talking privately with Samuel and Ruth before pronouncing himself satisfied with their placement. The paperwork was surprisingly simple: a few signatures, some official stamps, and suddenly Samuel and Ruth Patterson became Samuel and Ruth McKinley. As they walked out of the church under the bright spring sun, Thomas felt a completion he hadn't experienced since before the fire. His family was different now, built from loss and choice rather than birth and blood, but it was real and legal and permanent. That evening, they celebrated with a special dinner, and Ruth's first attempt at baking a cake. The results were lopsided and slightly burnt, but no dessert had ever tasted sweeter to Thomas. As they sat around the table afterward, Ruth reached for the family journal they'd started keeping, a record of their new life together that would complement the old journal that had brought them together. "What should I write for today?" she asked, pencil poised over a fresh page. Thomas looked around the table at these children who become his children, at this house that had become a home again, at Sarah's portrait watching over them all with painted eyes that seemed to approve of the new family taking shape beneath her gentle gaze. "Write that today the McKinley family became official," he said. "But more important, write that we've learned love doesn't end with death. It just finds new ways to grow." Samuel smiled, the careful expression he'd worn for months finally giving way to the unguarded happiness of a child who knew he was home. Ruth carefully wrote Thomas's words in her best penmanship, then added her own postscript. "And the lady in the painting brought us together just like Ma always said she would." Outside, the Wyoming wind carried the scent of growing things across the plains, and the future stretched ahead of them full of ordinary days made extraordinary by the simple miracle of family chosen and family found.